Hello and welcome to Identirati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and this is episode 14, What's Unique About NFTs? And our guest today is Steve Wilson. Welcome, Steve.
Hey Mike, how are you? Thanks for having me. It's a thrill to be here.
And Otto Mora. Welcome, Otto.
Hello, Mike. Thanks for inviting me. Pleasure to be here.
So maybe we should start it off with a simple question about our audience is an identity audience. They might not know about NFTs. What are NFTs exactly? And Steve, if you want to defer to Otto on this one, because Otto's from Polygon, one of the more successful blockchain companies out there. Steve, do you want to take this one, or you want to maybe pass it to Otto?
I think Otto is going to be much more authoritative about NFTs than I am.
All right, I'll try my best.
Put you on the spot, Otto.
Yeah. So in blockchain systems, NFTs are a specific type of token that is what is called a non-fungible token. So that means that it is distinguishable from other tokens, right? That's like the first part of it. In blockchain, we have these virtual assets, and some of them are what we call fungible tokens. That means they're all equal amongst one another and indistinguishable, just like $1 bill is equal to $1 bill physically, and you don't distinguish between them. And then we have NFTs, which are a different type of virtual asset or virtual token, or like representation of an asset, which could be physical or real, depending on how it is defined. And what's unique is that, unlike the fungible ones, it is distinguishable from one another. Each NFT is a unique sort of virtual asset on the blockchain sort of ecosystem, right? Now, the NFTs could be used for a variety of things. Some people like to use them for virtual art. And the NFT itself, the smart contract, will have a reference to a link where the virtual art is located. Other people like to do tokenization of physical assets, where you can maybe get a timeshare on a yacht on a given week with an NFT, or it gives you a right to go to a concert. Or maybe if you buy a physical good, then you also get the NFT, which allows you to go to an additional side event. So there's a variety of ways in which NFTs can be used, but the most important thing is sort of this unique aspect about it, where it could be a virtual good or a physical good, but it is sort of unique. So that's my take on it.
I heard an analogy, and actually, I just read the ERC, which is like the spec definition of NFT, and it says that an NFT is like a deed. So I think sometimes people conflate the asset with the deed. So I have a deed to a house. It's not the house itself, but it's a contract that says that I have the right, that I own this house. And I think that's a useful differentiation, because I think some people thought out there like the picture itself is the asset, but it's really not.
Yeah.
Steve, did you have any thoughts about NFTs, like just sort of baselining?
Yeah. This question about what's unique about them, I think, comes from the title of a blog I wrote, where I was having a bit of a play on words about uniqueness. I mean, people will say, an NFT is just a JPEG on a blockchain, or a pointer on a blockchain, and I can copy the JPEG anyway. So what's really special, what's unique about the NFT? Like what is the NFT as a security mechanism delivering me that I'm not getting in any other way? So there's that question about uniqueness. But the other issue about uniqueness, that I spent quite a long time thinking about this and coming to this idea that NFTs and Bitcoin, and DIDs for that matter, decentralized identifiers, they all have a common kind of design pattern to them, and it has to do with uniqueness. Now, I don't even know if uniqueness is the right word, but security geeks are always talking about confidentiality, integrity, availability as the three dimensions of security. I think that that's definitely limited. I think in the last 10 years, we've seen that we need more dimensions to think about privacy that are orthogonal to those three things. And I wonder if uniqueness is one of the missing dimensions. And by uniqueness, I mean, if you've got a set of ones and zeros, how do you know that those things are original, like you've never seen them before? And how do you know that they're being presented in a unique way? And that's kind of a bit of a holy grail in digital. I mean, I think most digital people, most scientists thought that ones and zeros can't be unique by definition. So that question of fungibility comes in. But look, here's the thing. What I think was kind of really common, the common pattern between NFTs, DIDs, and BTC, Bitcoin, they're politically common. They all come from a political decentralization move. We want to get rid of admin. We want to put the power back into the community so that it's shared across the community in a flat way. So that's pretty interesting. If you have that sort of culture or that sort of set of starting assumptions, if that's the environment that you're in, decentralized, no admin, then these questions of originality become really interesting. Like, what is original? Who's authoritative? We're crowdsourcing decision-making on the blockchain. So the thing that's really unique about these things is that an NFT, when you strike an NFT or you mint an NFT and you put that on the blockchain as a digital object, the community can agree through consensus that that's the first time we've ever seen that set of ones and zeros. So if those sets of ones and zeros happen to be an image, then what you have is originality of the image. Like, the community agrees that we've never seen that JPEG before. That's exactly what Bitcoin did. Bitcoin basically stops the race condition between two people that are trying to move ones and zeros at the same time. And you solve that race condition through consensus that says, here is an event that's been signed by a public key, signed by a private key, a Bitcoin account. And the consensus mechanism agrees that we've never seen that movement before. So we're going to vote and say that that's the original Bitcoin movement. And finally, DIDs is the same thing. Bring this back to identity, Mike. The Identirati have been interested for a very long time in BYOID, like bring your own identifier. How can you own an identifier and bring it to a community and say, this is me. You've never seen this identifier before, it's mine. And if you want to do that without a central admin, like a register that says I'm essentially registering every ID, that was an unsolvable problem until the Bitcoin blockchain came along, and then people realized that you could put DIDs on a blockchain. And what that means to me is I'm going to mint a new ID. I'm going to strike the ID for the first time. I'm going to get the consensus algorithm to vote and to determine that this is the first time anybody's ever seen this. And because it's bound to my private key, then it's Steve Wilson's ID. And that was sort of the holy grail. Like, how could Steve Wilson bring his own identifier to a community and convince people without a register that this is really me? What I'm going to put out there as a closing sort of idea is just that's a kind of a really special trick. It's hard to do. We didn't think that we could solve dollar spending, for example, but we did with Bitcoin blockchain. So it's a hard trick. So what? I mean, I honestly think that it's almost an academic trick. I think when it comes to marrying these things to the real world through tokenization or hybrid private-public blockchains, I think we sort of lose the magic trick of originality, and it's cheaper and easier to get originality through a register. So that's where I'm at. I think what's unique is these things provide uniqueness, but it's uniqueness in a very special sort of environment, a very special green field that's decentralized, no admin. There's only one way to do it with a blockchain.
Well, I would agree that in the blockchain definition itself, it says that each NFT must have a unique token ID and also a unique location on the blockchain. And those two things make a compound, basically unique identifier. Like, you could have something with the same token ID, but you can't have something with the same token ID and the same blockchain address.
Yep.
So it doesn't really say, actually the schema defines, there's schema and methods that define the NFT. The methods define, like, how is it transferred? How do you find out, I guess, the supply of tokens? And the schema is pretty light on NFT. We actually we're looking up the definitions, and there's actually two relevant standards. One is ERC 721, which is the non-fungible token standard. And then we were looking at, there's another ERC called ERC 4910, which is the royalty-bearing NFT. So it's a different, but I don't know, when I look at NFTs, they always struck me as how sparse they are. Like they really don't say a lot at all. And I was always surprised at how much excitement there was. Oh, this, given how little they actually do when you look at the spec. I don't know. Otto, any thoughts about this? I don't know if you think you're in the identity space too. I don't know if you think about this deeply, but maybe I could put you on the spot.
I mean, I think they're a little bit more public than it did, if I may, in the sense that when you have the NFT, you sort of say to the world, here, I'm holding this digital, painting or digital other thing, which is sort of to me like having a sticker on the back of your car that says, I'm a Giants fan, or I am, I don't know, I'm the proud parent of somebody that's serving in the army, something like that, right? It's very public. Whereas with the identifier, maybe I mean, it is public if you reveal it, right? If you reveal it to a given person. But with the blockchain, it's sort of like, behind this address is somebody that likes these types of digital paintings or some other thing. So I think it's public in that way, but there are things that people want to have visible outside, right? There's that idea. So yeah, I mean, I think it also, when you see DAO communities and such, which use NFTs as sort of this membership requirement, it is some form of identity. I mean, that is definitely there as well.
I guess the thing for me is what is the domain that we're trying to be unique upon, or what is the domain within which we're trying to signal anything interesting about ourselves? So the thing to me about NFTs, like if I take a Rembrandt and photograph it and digitize it and put that JPEG onto a blockchain, it's a hybrid situation where my ownership of the digital thing is incontrovertible thanks to the NFT and the blockchain. But my ownership of the Rembrandt depends on a binding that's made off-chain by somebody who says this is Steve Wilson's Rembrandt. And is it really a genuine Rembrandt? So who's valued the thing? Same thing like tokenized bottles of wine and that sort of thing. I think it was Christie's, one of the big auction houses, played with NFTs a few years ago, and I think they put some sort of painting on the blockchain as an NFT. And my head exploded. Like, you don't get any more centralized than a Christie's. Like, you have a central, literally an auction house of experts that talk about art, and we know there's only like 6 people in the world that can identify a Rembrandt, so that's pretty centralized. And trust, you got to trust that expert to say this is a Rembrandt. So it's hardly zero trust, it's hardly decentralized. For Christie's to then say, we've determined that this is Steve Wilson's Rembrandt, and we've determined that it's a Rembrandt, and we've determined that this JPEG is the JPEG of the Rembrandt. Now I'm going to put it on the blockchain. Well, so what? What's it doing out there? My lesson is that NFTs make sense for purely digital assets, in the same way that Bitcoin Bitcoin is a purely digital currency makes a hell of a lot of sense. But as soon as you start to tokenize on the Bitcoin blockchain and say, look, here's a $1 on the blockchain, my head explodes. It's kind of, it's just decentralizing different. You're still relying on a tokenization server. You're relying on Christie's to say this NFT is a Rembrandt. If the NFT is of a purely digital asset that people want to buy and sell and seek royalties and have a smart contract that makes sure that the originator of that digital artwork is always paid in perpetuity, I reckon that's fantastic. Like, I'm on board with that. But I only see it working for purely digital assets.
Actually, Otto, you made a really good point there, and Steve, you reminded me in your discussion of this. But so remember the NFT is the deed, and it's not the asset, and so I think it could be a real world asset as long as you can enforce that in the real world.
Right.
So the deed, whether that's recorded on a blockchain or whether it's in a bank vault, those are 2 different approaches. but maybe having it on a blockchain, as long as you're okay with it being public, is okay. But Otto, you made an interesting point about DAOs, and this might bridge us to identity.
Mhm.
Um, One of the things that I've seen is possession of an NFT might enable you to get access to a Discord server. So I can present my deed for my house sitting in my bank vault to get access to a Discord server. However, I can prove ownership of that NFT and present that NFT in order to get access to something like a Discord server, or maybe I don't know what else DAOs do besides
Mike,
Discord.
I'm sorry. I know that this question's for Otto, but I just want to level set before we go to
Yeah.
Otto. If it's a deed, who says that the deed corresponds to the actual asset? If it's a physical asset and I've got a digital deed on an NFT, I'm still worried about how do I bind? I still got to go to a trusted third party. There needs to be one person trusted in the world that says, oh, that is Steve Wilson's house and that's the NFT. So the binding, that's where, and if you agree that the binding is in the hands of a third party,
Yeah.
why put anything on a blockchain? Just put it in a database.
Maybe, well,
Uh,
that's definitely an Otto question.
yeah, no, but I think I sort of agree with some of the concerns that Steve is laying out, right? Like right now, if I buy an NFT on a video game or some other platform, there's sort of this social consensus that, this is my in-game, like, I don't know, special asset, special gun that I bought or some other thing, right? But there's not much enforceability like beyond that, right? Like you always need like social consensus, or there's even not enough jurisdiction or jurisprudence around like what happens if there's a controversy or a challenge to my ownership of that asset and so on, right? We sort of haven't had um, enough I guess legal recognition of virtual asset ownership at this point, or even the fact that that virtual asset is tied to some physical good or physical experience of some kind. I think that's true. We don't have yet firm legal standing as far as I've been able to see in doing that binding between the virtual token and some physical good or some physical experience or whatever that I may buy. I think that is definitely there, and we're right now relying on these like loose social consensus rules that if I buy this NFT, then therefore I can go to this party. But what happens if there's a challenge in that
And that
situation?
challenge is
Or
always going to happen off chain. And that's the challenging thing about smart contracts is that there's always
yeah,
some off chain action so a DAO, the idea that a DAO could be purely on chain, in the limit or in the extreme, there's always going to be an off chain, action or an off chain push or some sort of off chain, dispute resolution that takes us outside of the blockchain universe.
what I would say though, just to um, the one thing that I would say that's a benefit of perhaps having it on the blockchain. But I do agree that right now, we don't have like legal standing or how to manage disputes properly. That all of that's being sorted out right now. um, is that at least there's sort of a history of things that is immutable, right? Maybe that's a benefit in some kind, like if in the case of a dispute, you would be able to see, oh, this person bought it from this other person, and then this person transferred it to this other person, right? At least there would be a little bit of that traceability. Maybe that's the one benefit, whereas with a maybe traditional centralized registry, like there's not that cryptographic assurance that this history of data is like verifiable. uh, but yeah.
You know, the chances that a judge in the United States has a crypto wallet is probably pretty low. So the chances that they're going to understand what this whole, like, what a blockchain even is also pretty low. Um, but I was looking into blockchain and DAOs as a way to maybe provide an alternate organizational infrastructure for an open source project, which is also can be very decentralized. And I came to the conclusion that there has to be some type of real world entity that anchors that organization in the real world, because there has to be a corporation. If you want to, for example, I heard of a DAO that is buying a forest. and they're raising money and they're buying forest land, which they're gonna reserve. Um, but in order to actually buy that forest, you need a real company, and you need to pay
Mm.
real, actual money and have. And so I think it's the same with NFTs. Instead of it being an image, that could be an image of a legal document, of a deed. So, but in order to actually get enforceability, if you want to say, no, that's my image, you don't have the right to use this. And we see, Disney will send you a cease and desist probably pretty quickly if you use their digital assets. So we can see the enforcement of digital assets. The question is it worth it to do that?
Yeah.
And in order to do that, I think you need some company there in the real world to ground it.
And then the question is, what's the blockchain for? Because the blockchain is supposed to be massively redundant, zero trust, get rid of single points of failure. But as soon as you have any, and I'm just going to use the word tokenization in the broadest possible sense, but you need, the tokenizing agent needs to vouch for the correspondence of the thing on the blockchain and the thing in the real world. That's a single point of failure. That tokenization service is a single point of failure, and it's a trusted point of failure. So it's kind of, I'm like, if you go to all of that work to create a decentralized consensus apparatus where the community can agree on the time order of things, or resolve race conditions and agree on the ownership of a purely digital thing, which is an amazing, don't get me wrong, I think it's an amazing achievement mathematically to have consensus about the ownership of a digital thing. But if you then rely on a third party to say that digital thing, by the way, represents this house or Rembrandt, or like, frankly, I reckon Nakamoto rolls in their grave, because that's the single point of failure that the blockchain works so hard to get rid of, and then we're just putting it back in again.
How centralized the blockchain is always a question. I don't know, Otto. Maybe you can tell us about Polygon. Are there a bunch of nodes? I know Bitcoin is very decentralized, but each blockchain is more or less decentralized. And
Yeah,
Polygon's a layer 2, right?
yeah, Polygon's layer 2. I think it's right now a little over 100 nodes, which they also kind of cap it also for performance reasons, right? Like you
Sure.
can't have, like, the more nodes you have, the more degradation. But I think also the point that Steven's raising is interesting, right? Like, sort of Satoshi's argument, it's like, let's disrupt the banks, let's disintermediate, right? And some people took that disintermediation sort of narrative and ran with it, and let's say, like, oh, we're going to disintermediate financial stock, like companies, banks, like, all these other, intermediary platforms, which are like value extracting and just like centralizing and then, so, like, okay, like, let's go through like the exercise of what that actually means. Like, okay, if you take out like the banks, if you take out the I don't know, stock exchange companies, how do you're replacing that with trusting this set of node operators, and on top of that, you need sort of dispute resolution mechanism. So, which could be a centralized entity, right? So, what have you resolved, right? That's which I sort of get this argument. I mean, I think that's very true, right? Some people exaggerated this intermediation narrative to say, oh, we're going to solve everything with just a blockchain.
Well,
And
and
we're still
you
not
know
there.
why?
Yeah.
Because the language that we used was magic words. There were words like decentralized and consensus. And I've, there's a book on my shelf that I won't name it to protect the guilty, but there's a very, very famous blockchain book that talks about consensus and talks about revolutionizing democracy and actually putting government on the blockchain. And I reckon that they made that stretch, like Otto talks about them stretching. And I think they made that stretch because they saw the word consensus as a magic word, and they thought, cool, let's put voting on the blockchain. And the mistake is that consensus mathematically is actually a very narrow idea, and it had to do with a set of people arriving at consensus about the order of events, the order of entries in the blockchain. And I think that magic word, it got exaggerated. We thought that we could decentralize everything. And I think that we get it around the wrong way too. Like, I think decentralization comes first. And then the question is, how do you solve double spend? And then you solve it with a blockchain. So blockchain doesn't decentralize. Blockchain comes in after you've made the decision to decentralize. You've set up a community that agrees to go without an admin. then you've got a tough problem. How do you assign ownership of Bitcoin? Well, blockchain, brilliant idea, seriously brilliant, but it's got to come after decentralization.
I always thought that decentralization was over emphasized. Like what I always thought blockchain gave me was immutability. I can't change this transaction because I have to change all the other transactions. Um, and decentralization, Tim Berners-Lee said, my web was already decentralized.
My web.
I think that
Yeah.
that's true.
I hope he
But
was being ironic about that.
I don't think he was, though, because how many web servers do we have? We have millions. So whether somebody gets power or not, it's still a decentralized infrastructure. But let's not get too diverted on that. I actually want to pivot back to identity, because the reason I took this talk is because I have to say I'm also somewhat fascinated by NFTs. And I think that there are a lot of similarities between NFTs and decentralized identity and parallels. And one that I see is this idea of presentation of the identity from a wallet. So whether I'm presenting a NFT or I'm presenting a verifiable credential, I do think that there is some similarities there. And maybe also what we can learn is some of the challenges that we found with NFTs might be maybe a warning to us about some of the challenges we might find in identity. Otto, maybe I could put you on the spot and you can tell us a little bit about Polygon's identity product, because I'm sure you guys have been thinking about this for some time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also a relevant question. It's sort of this problem that Sean was alluding to is like the binding of the NFT to the physical good. You still have that in blockchain, right? The binding of this person's identity to their Ethereum address and this NFT that's in there, that's a hard problem to solve, right? Some people have tried soul-bound tokens, but that at least makes it NFT non-transferable, but that still doesn't solve the problem of how do you tie that person's identity to that Ethereum address to avoid other kinds of problems. So what we've done is we've enabled sort of verifiable credentials to be used with a blockchain system, right? And in doing so, we tie a given Ethereum address to an identifier or set of identifiers, right? It could be. And then we're able to demonstrate through zero knowledge proofs that you are in possession of a credential when you're operating with a given Ethereum address, right? So I have a KYC credential that demonstrates that I am a resident of a specific country without revealing all of the other details that go along with that, or I am over 18, or I have a credit score in this particular range, let's say between 500 and 600, without revealing all of that information. That does still require the holder binding, right? We do still need methods to ensure that the holder binding is done properly. But the nice, elegant thing about this is that some of that data, that identity data, can be off-chain in a verifiable credential, and the presentation of it can be a zero-knowledge proof, which can enhance privacy. And you can still submit some of this data on-chain if you so wish to do some other operation. So I think that's sort of the angle that we're taking, and we're sort of trying to convert this world where people just use soul-bound tokens for everything and NFTs for everything into a world where they're also using DIDs and VCs for what they're good for, right? Which is sort of managing your identity and your credentials.
So you're saying that the proofs are on the chain, but the verifiable credentials and the identity data is not.
So the issuer's DID is advertised on chain, and that's registered on chain, right? Sort of using the blockchain as the verifiable data registry.
Mhm.
From there, you get a credential, which is a sort of a verifiable credential, in our case, a JSON LD file that lives off chain, but has that signature of the DID from the issuer. From that credential, you can choose to generate a presentation. The presentation could be either a selective disclosure of data or a zero knowledge proof. The zero knowledge proof, you could just hand it to another person and they can verify the correctness of it privately, or they could take that zero knowledge proof and submit it onto a blockchain, verify its correctness as well, and then take some other action, such as an airdrop, or take some other action that involves blockchain operation of some kind. But the zero knowledge proof or that presentation need not be on chain necessarily, right? It's sort of an optional thing whether you choose to feed that into a smart contract and take some action or not.
Yeah. So, um, Steve, you were talking about DIDs, and now I'll get on to my next topic of more complexity that we can handle in 15 minutes. But I'm cautious about DIDs because there are so many DID methods. So DIDs to me don't really mean very much. It's almost like the DID is your way in your neighborhood of telling your address. But there's all these different neighborhoods, and so I wonder. I see the connection between digital identity and NFTs, but DIDs I see as being, they just seem so arbitrary to me what the DID is.
I'm glad to hear you say that, Mike. That makes two of us.
Yeah, I was at IAW. I saw a presentation on like a new DID method. So I don't think it's over yet. We're still seeing more DID methods. So, and I think this DID method was actually using the web.
Yeah.
at IAW, which was interesting. But Otto, what DID methods are you using? When you said you're using DIDs, what DID methods are you using? Did you define your own in Polygon ID?
Yes, we did define our own, which is called DID Polygon ID. It also has an alternate name called DID Ident3 because we don't want to be just tied to a given blockchain. We want to be kind of multi-chain. We have been discussing interoperability with the folks from Quark ID in Argentina. So there's like some alignment in the objectives. But I do agree that it is a very complex landscape with a lot of DID methods out there. Right now that we have, sort of Apple and Google starting to look at that, it's going to be an interesting, next few months to see which DID methods they start sort of integrating, right? Like why should they, right? Because it is a very complex landscape, and I think we need in the identity world to come together and start having a more serious conversation around interoperability and how do we enable this, because otherwise like it's going to be hard to get adoption of DIDs and VCs.
We've seen this pattern before. I mean, the DID community is now talking about DID resolvers because there's no standard DID method, so we're going to have a third party or a fifth party or something. There's going to have to be a new intermediary that does DID resolution. We've brought this on ourselves. We've brought this complexity on ourselves because I don't think we're clear about the problems that we're trying to solve. So, I mean, I get accused of being too reductionist for what I'm about to say, but to me, this all just boils down to data and metadata. And by that, I mean, identity is an emotional topic and it's complicated. As Otto says, it's so complicated that, the identity still argue about the definition of the identity, that they say that they're identity professionals, but they don't actually know what identity is. So why don't we find a set of language that diffuses the subjectivity of it? And I think that language comes down to data. And before anybody gets upset, I like to say that two people dealing with each other online, they want to know things about each other. And we usually call that identity, but we can be more specific. Like, I want to know if you're over 21 years of age, or I want to know that you're eligible to vote, or I want to know that you're eligible for health insurance. So those things are just facts and they can be presented in zero knowledge proofs, and that's brilliant. So what problem we're trying to solve? We're just trying to solve facts. Now, it gets complicated because the facts need to be bound to people. So there's two sorts of bindings, the binding of where did the fact come from, and the binding of who does the fact relate to, and can the subject of the fact actually hold the fact and then present it. So it boils down to this: everybody's got the issue has got a key pair and the subject has got a key pair, and they need to be in the right hands. So the pattern for end users is pretty simple now, with a wallet of some sort, hopefully a hardware bound wallet, and that key pair is physically bound to me because I know the whatever. the issuer binding is sort of more complicated. If I'm holding a proof of age, zero knowledge proof that I'm over 21 years of age, but the relying party still needs to know who the authority is that said that the holder is over 21 years. So was it a DMV, for example? We're seeing sort of a marketplace of proof of age for adult services, and that's sort of a weird thing that's happening in the UK. But all of this means that there's different proofs from different issuers. So the relying party needs to know about the issuer. So then we get into issuer metadata. Who is the issuer? Is the issuer official? Is the issuer legislated? Is the issuer audited? Is the issuer in country or in the cloud? So all of that issuer metadata, that concept of issuer metadata has only just been introduced into the W3C verifiable credential model for the first time in the last draft. And again, it's like we're reinventing the wheel, because the PKI community solved issuer metadata 30 years ago. That's what a root CA is about. You have a CA, an intermediate CA, and a root CA. And the root CA just says, I've got a community of users. It's the brand for all of the CAs in Australia. And then the intermediate CA says, well, I'm the CA of DMVs. So if you see me in the chain, you know that everybody beneath me is a real DMV. So for that problem set of proof of age from a DMV, the issuer metadata is baked into the certificate chain in a PKI hierarchy. The W3C people are reinventing the wheel, trying to do issuer metadata in a decentralized way, with the distributing public keys on a blockchain, but you're losing all of the issuer metadata. So I think after 30 years of PKI, for some reason, people feel the need to reinvent all of that stuff and come up with a new treatment of issuer metadata. And you know what? It's because some people find hierarchies distasteful, and other people find flattened community structures more satisfying. And I think a huge amount of this comes down to taste.
I don't know, Steve. I have to disagree with you on that one. So, well, PKI has been great. I mean, like, there wouldn't be an internet without HTTPS, right? Everything's built. So PKI has been fabulously successful. But it's also, we found it hasn't scaled with regard to the identity of people. Many European countries tried to roll out citizen smart cards and found that it wasn't really good for that. And also, even in the US government, we tried to roll out PKI identities for people, and we found that it was really expensive and didn't really work as well as we wanted, and we needed something different. So I don't think it's that. And actually,
that's not a PKI problem. That's a key carrier problem. And smart cards are now smartphones, and that problem's gone away.
Yeah, and I'll just say the last problem is that actually keep the root of trust has been an issue that's been of great concern to the industry. So I don't think it's that people inherently dislike the centralized manner of PKI. I think that we proved it didn't scale. Or didn't scale out to people.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but the scaling of, say, the USPIV system or smart cards in Europe, that's a matter of key carriers. It's got nothing to do with the root.
Well, just look at the cost, the amount of time that they had, and the amount of success that they had, and that's why I would say it failed.
But
and then the
GSM
around gaining interoperability.
The GSM smartphone system, 10 billion SIM cards in the world, they've all got a common root. And the same with the EMV payment card system. They've all got one root in the EMV system for something like 5 billion cards in circulation. So it's not the root problem that forces scaling. The problem is that sometimes we go too broad. So, the GSM SIM card is the oldest verifiable credential in the world. We've had them for 35 years. It's a signed assertion that binds a subscriber to an IMSI. It's a verifiable credential in a hardware wallet. It only does one thing. It's all it does is that it digitally signs the start and finish of a phone call. An EMV credit card only does one thing. It digitally signs a payment transaction to a merchant terminal. So these things do scale abundantly, but there must be some sort of law of conservation that says if you narrow down the scope of something, then you sort of squeeze out the scalability. I'm trying to find a visual for that. But when we
Yeah.
just try and come up with a general purpose identity, this is Steve Wilson, you can trust him. That problem, that's
Mhm.
got nothing to do with scale or roots or whatever. It's just a problem that's
So
probably theoretical.
is like your argument then that the smartphone is then this sort of extended or upgraded SIM card or EMV card is now can be bound to a person, with all the
Yeah,
biometric capabilities and so on. Like that would be essentially.
yeah, yeah. No, it's still not perfect, and the biometrics not perfect, and we still have, whether it's a matter of taste or security, we do still have issues with the platforms having too much control over the wallets. Absolutely big problem. But I do think that the form factor, we've got a human factors engineering problem that we thought that we could have just one certificate that did general purpose identity, and that, of course, is silly because you wind up with a certificate practice statement that's too fat, and it's just that's big PKI. That did fail. Smart cards, Mike and I go back so far that we've tried to use smart cards in all sorts of scenarios, and they have interoperability problems for sure. But I think the human factors engineering is largely solved with wallets and smartphones, preserving the cryptography. I mean, I've been a believer in hardware keys since 1995. Now we've got it with secure elements. We've consumerized hardware keys in secure elements in phones. It's a brilliant thing. So I do think that that's sort of the platform that helps us solve a lot of these problems at scale. And it gives people choice. Like there would be no one size fits all verifiable credential. There'd be different overlapping communities that have their own credentials for their own use cases.
And what about the other? Because I hear this argument a lot on identity forums, like the root of trust, right? Some people think like having the certificate authorities creates like this cartel of certificate authorities that have too much control and influence and kind of deprive people of being identified. Other people say like if we also like just let it up to governments, that creates other problems with some people being even stripped out of their nationality and so on.
Yeah.
And some people in Web3 have this dream of like, oh, we can just be completely, decentralized and have like a decentralized root of trust with just like social consensus of me agreeing that you are you and things like that. But I find it so complex. I don't know if there's a
I think
future there.
Otto, you talked about the social contract before. And I think that's right. If you had a big community of people with the social contract that they're going to behave in a certain way and respect certain power structures, then absolutely you could do that. But at the moment, the confusion about root CAs and the and the fear of root CAs, I think, is a bit misplaced because root CA is just a brand. So there is physically a root CA behind your MasterCard, and it's a root CA that MasterCard operates, and there's a root CA that Visa operates. And the GSM network used to have a brand. The GSM brand was a thing, and it's just it's operationalized by a root CA. So I think that this idea of root CAs taking control, it's got to do with the social contract that I agree to use a MasterCard, and not everybody's down for that. So that's absolutely fine. Maybe we would have decentralized DeFi communities that play by a different set of rules, and all power to them. I think that's fantastic. But the idea that I don't think we have any mystical power in an ID or a DID. Like the idea that I can control my DID and I can have an uncensored identity in the form of a DID, I think is wishful thinking, because it's not like I can go to Facebook and say, "Here's my DID, God damn it, you're gonna use this DID." So one, they can't do that. Secondly, the idea that nobody can censor me once I've got my DID. Well, no, I'm sorry. If the bank says your credit's no longer good, Mr. Wilson, we're going to cut off your account. It doesn't matter what identity technology I choose to use. The power is in the server. So the final thing about citizenship, the idea of the root CA and your citizenship and your autonomy. Well, I'm sorry, real world citizenship does lie with the Australian government, and there's only one way I can deal with that, and it's not a technological way. If I want to secede literally from the Australian government, then that's a physical thing I've got to do. And it doesn't matter what DID I've got or what blockchain I'm using. I'm on my own,
And the Australian government has chosen to go with OpenID with a federated model before going to a decentralized model. Well, Actually, we're hitting the final the end of the show, I should say. Maybe or Otto will, as a co-host, any final thoughts?
Oh, just all great conversations. I do agree with some of Stephen's original points about NFTs and sort of this oversold dream of we're disintermediating everybody, but no, it's true. You still need either a central authority or a third party authority that you're trusting to solve the ownership and dispute problem. Um, great also conversation around DIDs and root CAs and that. I think that's also a very interesting topic that we'll see where that evolves, and just excited to see where this future goes to. I mean, I think we definitely need to get the interoperability situation solved in the identity world, because that's what gave us ISO MDL. I feel like we just have these long discussions around the different DID methods and all these other things, didn't come to agreement, and ISO came along and just said, well, here's a nice simple format, and then just get the government to adopt it, and the government said, yeah, this looks good, I'll use it, right? So we definitely have to get our interoperability conversations going, so that we do get this and VCs adopted.
Steve, last thoughts from Australia?
It's been great. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Otto. Thanks for having me. I've enjoyed myself so much that I've lost my breath. That you can tell how energetic I've got about this conversation. So thanks, guys.
Okay, well, next week we have a really, or I'm sorry, on Thursday, we have a great conversation with Aaron Parecki, who's one of the OAuth gurus, about two topics. First party native authentication, which is what I wanted to talk about. Aaron wanted to talk about global token revocation. So we split the difference. We're going to talk about both. And we might have another special guest. We're waiting to see if he can get approval from his corporate organization. And yeah, thanks, Steve, for joining us. Thanks, Otto, for tuning in. And I know it's late there, Otto. And to audience, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you again on Thursday.
Thanks, Mike. Cheers.
Thank you.